Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Delahanty, the Superintendent of Schools in Salem, and with me this afternoon is Amy McSweeney, a parent of children at North Salem School, Heather Bonarigo, also a parent of children at North Salem School, Maura Palmer, our Assistant Superintendent for Academics and Support, and Debbie Payne, our Assistant Superintendent for Business Operations. So we're going to take some time this afternoon to answer questions that many of you have already submitted. Because of the volume of questions submitted, we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but to their credit, Amy and Heather have organized the questions under some pretty global headings because there were some similarities between most of the questions. So I think we can get to most of them. And if there are some imperative questions we don't reach, then we'll get to those later in a frequently asked questions area on our website. We're going to take, we hope, sufficient time this afternoon to provide you with comprehensive answers to the questions that are asked. Again, we're going to make some opening statements and then get right to the questions. Our plan was submitted to the Salem School Board last week, and the board supported our plan, which is to have students that want to return with parents that want their students to return, returning in September. I believe our first day for children will be September 2nd, although the first day for kindergarten students may be adjusted somewhat, which you'll find more out about later this month. And then some students that can't or don't want to or feel uncomfortable returning, or we're more successful in a remote or distance learning environment, we'll have that option as well. And people will want to know why we selected the environment we selected, and I'm sure that question will come up. How did we arrive at the environment we did? We've been at this for almost 2 months now in anticipation of having a reopening plan that would serve all our students. And by all our students, we feel that students in person will be served best, but nonetheless, students in a remote environment can be served similarly effectively as we did in the spring. There will be some differences, of course, and our challenge is to match the students that can't return with the teachers that can't return. It was certainly encouraging to us to learn that almost 95% of our teachers and support staff members will be returning. So a small number, about 40 altogether, support staff and professional staff, for one reason or another, and primarily and most likely because of a health issue or a health issue of a loved one or someone in the household, have to be more cautious and won't be able to return. So again, about 95% of our staff will be returning. And we're going to jump into your questions in just a moment. I want to get back to why this environment, just briefly. We ruled out the idea of some students participating remotely and some students participating physically, because quite candidly, that's just an unworkable environment. And you'd have to know exactly what teachers were dealing with day in and day out to know why we concluded that that was unworkable. So we felt that the best environment was to have children physically present, and secondary environment was to have those students unable to or unwilling to be in a remote environment. So with that said, I'm going to have Mrs. Palmer and Mrs. Payne make some preliminary remarks themselves. And Mrs. Palmer, do you want to start?
Thank you very much, Dr. Delahanty. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us on this very hot July afternoon, so hopefully you're sitting somewhere cool. My name is Maura Palmer. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Academics and Support. And as Dr. Delahanty said, we've been working hard on our back to school plans. One thing we know for sure is that this school year will be unlike any other, especially as we kick off. But I would like to assure everyone that there are many plans already in the works to ensure that your children have a smooth transition back to school, as smooth as they possibly can. Going back to our reopening plan, as we were developing it, we had several work groups And those that were under my supervision were the groups related to academics, related to special education, student supports, whole child supports, and distance learning and technology. And as a result of that work, we're continuing now to develop some professional development for the teachers for the start of school. As I mentioned last week at the school board meeting, and I'll say it again, our focus is really for the start of school to be supporting the students back into the learning environment as best we can, because we know that the time of remote learning presented not only some learning gaps potentially, but also some social emotional gaps with the social isolation that they may have felt. So again, we have some groups working now to develop professional development for our teachers, who in turn, and all of our staff, who in turn will work with your students at the start of school and transitioning back. So as we go along, I'm sure more questions will be answered.
Yes. Okay, thank you, Mrs. Palmer. And now Mrs. Payne will make some remarks, and I just want to acknowledge the work Mrs. Payne has done to secure the kind of equipment we need to make sure that our staff and students will be safe when they return. So, Mrs. Payne.
Thank you, Dr. Delahanty. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so glad that you were able to join us this afternoon. We've been working this summer to make sure that we have materials on hand. Many of the items that we ordered, we got a jump start at the end of this school year to begin to prepare for the fall reopening. Some items that we have already available for students and staff to be using include cloth face masks, hand sanitizer, additional cleaning materials that will be available, and we also have some transparent desk shields that will allow students and staff some additional protective layer during this returning environment. As I spoke last week at the school board meeting, some of the other areas that we've focused on are food service and bus transportation, and we'll talk about those a little bit further because there are some questions that I'm sure all of you have for us to answer.
Okay, thank you, Mrs. Payne. And again, our goal today, I'm going to turn this over to Amy and Heather in just a moment, but our goal today is to give you information to help you make an informed choice about whether or not it's, in your opinion, safe to have your child to return to school. And we hope we give you information that will do just that. So with that, Amy and Heather.
Great, thank you, Mike. As Mike mentioned, my name is Heather Bonarigo, and I have 2 students currently in the Salem School District, and I'm really excited to be here today to serve as a proxy for all those parents out there that are really wrestling right now with what am I going to do with my students come the fall. And we're all just trying to make those right decisions, not only for our families, but for our communities. So thank you for having me.
And hi, everyone. I'm Amy McSweeney. I'm a parent of an elementary student here in the district. And just to reiterate what Heather said, I'm thankful for this opportunity the district has given the 2 of us this afternoon to take some of these really important questions that are facing a lot of us parents as the start of the school year is really fast approaching. So with that, I'll just take a brief minute to explain what Mike has already kind of gone over in the intro. Is the goal of today's session is to go through all of the questions that have been submitted, but unfortunately there's I think over 500 individual questions at this point that have been submitted. There's some overlap in the topics, very similar grouping of topics. So the district has kind of gone through those and put them into categories so that you can make an informed decision as a parent if you want your child to return to in school or to possibly stay in a remote, distance learning environment. Heather, is there anything you would like to add to that intro?
Yeah, I would just say in terms of the process, we really thought this would be the most efficient use of our time together today. We do realize that there were some questions that came in that were very specific to individual needs and family circumstances. And so we understand that those will be addressed more specifically with the schools and the administrators that are tied to those specific circumstances. So before we dive into the questions, one just quick PSA for all the parents out there that are watching us today. This is going to be a tough decision for everybody, and we're all going to try to do the right thing for our families, for our community. And let's just take a vow right now that we're going to support each other's decision and each other's choice, and that we're going to respect that it might look different for different families, and that's okay. There's not one right answer here. So with all that being said, Mike, we're going to dive right in and get started here with some of the questions. And we're going to start with the more broad topics, and then we're going to hone into the more specific details as we go. So if you could just give us your insights at the highest level. When you made the decision that we were going to reopen Salem schools come the fall, what really went into that initial decision?
So first, everyone has to know that we've been at this since mid-May, looking at all of the data, looking at what other school districts in other states were doing, looking at how the data in those states impacted the decisions that those school districts made, and anticipating our state leaving the decision up to the local school districts. We didn't expect that the state would continue an emergency order which closed all schools, that it would be community-based and community-oriented. So we focused solely on what we thought was best for our community, knowing the culture and climate and the expectations of our parents and our students. And as excited as people were to jump into the remote or distance learning environment, that became very tired very quickly. So as hard as everyone was working, both teachers and support staff and students, frankly, for most of our students and for their parents, it just seemed that model was untenable. It might be necessary at some point to go into a distance or remote learning environment, and we kept that option open from the beginning. But we also wanted to bring everybody back, and we hoped the data would support that. And we kept in mind the idea that if we had to socially distance all our students at 6 feet, we weren't going to be able to bring our students back in a pragmatic way, because we did some measurements in our elementary classrooms, and at 6 feet social distancing with a teacher, we could get 9 students in. And we don't have any classrooms other than our kindergarten classes that have 18 students. So we couldn't even bring 50% of our students back. So knowing that and thinking in practical terms, and then hearing that Massachusetts had considered 3 to 6 feet as acceptable for social distancing. Once we heard that, we knew that we could go to 3 feet and get our typical size class back together. We had looked at some images from Europe and schools that had opened in Europe and in Asia, and saw these transparent shields. Knowing that was an added layer of protection, we decided to go in that direction, I think before anyone had recommended it. So we started to explore that as well. So ultimately, given our current status, New Hampshire is one of 4 incredibly safe states right now in terms of the numbers. We feel we're positioned, after all our efforts, after all our work, to bring our students back. But to your point, Heather, that you made just a moment ago, we are also very respectful of people who are unable, for whatever reason, or a little bit nervous about sending their children back, and we'll do everything we can to support them in a distance learning or remote environment.
Hi, Mike, can you talk a little bit more about why the safety protocols outlined in the plan were included and how they are being used to reduce risks?
So as I mentioned, the 3 to 6 feet was something that we knew we could do without masks, right? So this was when we were first going into the social distancing at 3 to 6 feet, we were pretty confident we could achieve that. And then information came out about the efficacy of mask wearing and how effective, again, if effective, mask wearing was. We know that we have not only our students in our schools, and we know that students are not as likely. We know students are at risk. We know students are at risk, but the students are not as likely to contract the virus. And with that said, we felt that by wearing masks, having the shields so they wouldn't have to wear their masks when they were at their desks, but wear their masks when they were in common areas. We felt confident that with the protocols, including hand sanitizer and social distancing when we could, that we could keep staff and students safe.
Great, thanks, Mike. So a lot of the elements that you just talked about made up a core set of the questions coming in from parents. And we're going to take a little time to get more specific into some of those safety elements. But for now, let's stick to the broader issues. So for those parents, and we trust that there's going to be some parents who just, they don't feel safe sending their kids back to school, or they don't want to send them back to a school that looks the way school is going to look in the fall. You are offering that remote learning option. And of course, folks need to sign up for that remote learning option by August 1st. But could you tell us a little bit about what does that option look like that folks would be signing their children up for?
So as I mentioned early on, about 94% of our staff have expressed a willingness to come back and be in the schools. Now, that is because we have given indications that we're affording very strong safety protocols. So mask wearing, for example, the protective shields, not only at the individual student desks, but at the teacher desks as well. There'll be that plastic, plexiglass or plastic separation. As I think I mentioned earlier, August 1st is the date because we have to match students with staff or teachers. Some of those students will be very difficult to match. So for example, if just hold on just a second, let me take care of something here. Okay, I'm sorry. So for example, if a high school student is scheduled to take a Spanish 4 class, and we don't have a teacher that is teaching Spanish 4, we have to figure out something to offer that student a class. And that's just one example of many, many examples that might arise. So we have to be able to accommodate the students that aren't coming to school and the students that are coming to school, and matching the teachers that are unable to be here and the students that are not able to be here. And we know that's going to be a lengthy process, and a month is a very short period of time when even in the best of years, opening school is a complex process.
If I could add on as well, Heather, you know, as part of our professional development that we're working on this summer, we're focusing on essential curriculum, and that would be for both the in-school and remote learning, so that regardless of the environment, the students would be in the same place with the same content. We also are working on training for teachers in the best practices for the technology use. We learned a lot from feedback in the spring. We learned from parent surveys, we learned from student focus groups, we learned from our teachers what some of the best practices were with the tech tools we were using. And so we're looking to train the teachers for us, taking that information and creating best practices. And that would again be for both the remote learners and the in-school learners. So the teachers will be using the tech tools and the students will, so that if at any point we need to change what we're doing, we're ready across the board. Our goal will be to keep the schedules as parallel as possible. That's another thing we learned from the spring. You know, if we can keep the high school students moving along the same schedule every day, it would be the best approach. I know we said in our plan that 1.5 to 2.5 hours of daily instruction was what we found the students could withstand, you know, practically. That's just an estimate based on what we learned in the spring, and we'll continue to fine tune that as we go and have further discussions. So again, you know, as far as the curriculum instruction goes, that's all part of our planning right now in July and into August.
Okay, great, thank you. So I have a follow-up question. I think for parents to feel comfortable making their decision, they'll need to know the rules around their ability to switch from in-person to remote learning or vice versa. What kind of commitment are parents making on August 1st? And what happens when or if they decide to make a change, either because maybe their student is struggling with wearing a mask at school, not performing well in the remote learning environment, or they just feel like the school you know, choice is just a little too risky for them. I don't know who wants to take
Sure.
that.
So I'll start. First, I'll say this. From mid-May until today, we have learned a lot about this virus and how this virus is spread, what's happening in other states, the increases in cases because of cavalier attitudes and sort of misguided thinking. Here in New Hampshire, we've reduced cases significantly. The Harvard Global Health Institute just created a website where individuals can go and look at individual counties in every state. And they have a color-coded sort of category. Green means you have less than 1 case per 100,000 people. Yellow means you have between 1 and 9 cases per 100,000 people. And by that, I mean within the last 7 days. So it's a rolling calculation of how counties in every state fare within their own state. There are 3 counties here in New Hampshire that are at green. All the other counties, including Rockingham, are at yellow. And so, I mean, that wasn't something that was available to us even a month ago. That's right now. And the knowing that we have between 1 and 9 cases in the last 7 days just in Rockingham County should be encouraging for parents. Nonetheless, there's still a month before children are expected to come back. So within that month, if parents change their mind, if something comes up in 2 weeks, if something comes up in 3 weeks, and they've indicated they want their children not to return to school, we will have a structure in place that's better than the structure we have today, because we don't have a structure right now. We won't have a structure until we know the number of students not returning. Once we have that number, we match them with the teachers that aren't returning, and we figure that out. Then we have a structure. Then if somebody else wants to opt out because of some new information, we'll allow them to opt out. Once the environment begins in September and those assignments have been made, we would ask people to maintain their choice for a term. So for elementary schools, that would be a trimester. And for middle and high school, that would be for the first semester. That's what we're asking people. Now, if something were to happen and there's an individual circumstance that warrants a change, we, as we always do, we would certainly entertain that, that change. So in terms of whether or not people feel compelled and pressured to make a decision that they can't get out of, they'll have some time, but I would only ask that they wait to see if there's some evidence that warrants a change.
Great, thanks, Mike. That definitely was helpful. So what I think we'll do now is start to move toward some more specifics, specifically around the safety protocols, because that was the majority of the line of questioning of parents. And we're going to do this kind of more as the speed round and go a little more rapid fire to see if we can't move through as many of these as we possibly can. So let's start with the most obvious one. So the question around masks and face coverings. Who needs to wear a mask and when do they need to wear them?
Okay, so all staff, visitors, and students will be required to wear a face mask inside of our buildings. And that includes preschool through grade 1 students who were initially excluded from the reopening plan. We've had further conversations and determined that it makes the most sense for all individuals to be wearing a mask inside. Now that's in hallways, in common areas, and on the buses. Once a student or a staff member is behind one of the acrylic shields at their desk or in the cafeteria in the lunchroom, at that point in time, that student or staff member can remove their face mask.
So when it comes to face masks, does this include when they're in PE or chorus or recess?
Great question. So if for physical education, students will not be required to wear a face mask because we will practice social distancing. And some PE classes will be held outside as long as the weather works out, they'll be outdoors. If they're inside, they will be spread out so that social distancing is able to happen. For chorus, because of an increase in air exchange, students will be required to wear a face mask. And for recess, now I want to clarify, morning arrival, when students first get to school, all students will have their face mask on. But once they go out for recess during the daytime, they'll be out with a cohort of students that they've been together with during the day. And so at that point in time during recess, students will not need to wear their face mask. Now a question that might come up is, well, what will they do with their face mask then? So we will be giving all students either a lanyard or a fanny pack to hold, keep their face mask clean at those times when they don't need to be wearing it.
I love to hear about the lanyard and fanny pack because as a mom, that's something that I've been thinking about a lot is how are they not going to lose these things? So, what's the criteria that would be acceptable for someone not wearing a mask and how should a parent address this issue if it's a concern?
Okay, so that will be on a case-by-case basis. There might be a certain medical condition or a situation that's contained in a student's learning plan, their 504 or an IEP, that excludes them from needing to wear a mask. So those types of situations can be worked out with the principal or the specialist that the student typically works with. So as we get closer to school, those conversations can be had.
Great. So the masks are being provided by the school district, correct? And can you explain a little bit about the distribution? Can people use their own personal masks? Any guidance there on what type of masks people can bring from home?
Absolutely. Okay, so all students and staff members will be issued 5 cloth face masks. These are washable, reusable masks. They're blue on the outside, white on the inside. They have an adjustable earpiece, and they also have a nose piece to make it more comfortable to fit to the face of whoever's wearing the mask. We have them in different sizes, and every student and staff member will receive 5. Now, parents will be able to pick those masks up the week before school begins. Principals will reach out with times and dates, but that way, if a family would like to wash their masks before the first day of school, that's certainly doable. So again, 5 masks for every student, and again, also a lanyard or fanny pack for the mask to be held on or tucked into during the day. In addition, we'll have extra disposable and reusable face masks available in all classrooms, in all offices, at the nurse's office. So if a face mask gets dirty during the day or wet or something like that, we'll have a replacement face mask for a student or staff member who may need it. In terms of other options, there may be some staff members or students, for whatever reason, a medical condition or something that makes wearing a face mask difficult. And for those students, we have a combination shield. It has a cloth that goes underneath the chin, and it has a Velcro that goes around the head. So the nice thing about that type of a face mask is that it makes facial features more visible. So for our speech language pathologists, that's the type of mask that they would wear. For those times when somebody might want to wear their own mask, that's no problem. The only requirement that we have, if you'd like to bring in a mask from home, is that it covers the mouth and nose.
Great, thank you. That was super helpful. So moving to another piece of PPE that was mentioned earlier on, why did we decide to add the transparent shields to our desks and our tables in the cafeteria and such?
So, our goal is to keep our staff and our students safe. We acknowledging that there is a risk, but we also know that students being at home presents its own set of risks, which I'm sure we'll get to later on. We also believed that students would feel uncomfortable wearing a mask all day long. So we had to think of a way that we could provide them an opportunity to remove their masks, not feel as awkward, as simultaneously keeping our staff and the students around them safe. Again, acknowledging that there are risks with everything, we feel these transparent shields provide the layer of protection that everyone needs when students are not wearing their masks. When they're not behind a shield, they will be wearing a mask. And I'm convinced that mask wearing is critical. So having the combination of masks and the shields when they're not wearing the mask keeps our degree of safety high.
Excellent. So can you give us a little bit more information about what are the shields made of, and how and where will they be installed?
So the face masks are, the shields are made of acrylic. They're a three-sided transparent shield, and it's like looking through a window. So even if you were looking through 4 or 5 of them, it would be the same view as looking out a window. So it's a clear product. These will be attached to the desks with a double-sided industrial strength tape. They're very secure, so that those shields are not going anyplace. They're going to be on every student desk, and in classrooms where students may be at a table, they'll be on the table instead, so that a student has protection from the student next to them. In addition, they'll be located on teacher desks and also on the cafeteria tables for lunchtime, and in offices, you'll see them around the building as well. So, and these, because they're three-sided, they're going to provide that droplet protection on both the front and the sides.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. So I'm thinking if these shields are doing their job, they're going to get pretty dirty. So what's the cleaning plan for these shields?
So the shields and the desktop. So we have to really think about the surfaces that students are really touching and the germs could be spreading. So our intention is to have elementary students will be sitting at the same desk all day, so it's their space. But for middle school and high school students, we know that they do change classrooms. So there will be an opportunity at the end of each period for every desk to be sprayed and wiped down, so that way the germs, wherever you put your hands on your surface, the desktop will be sprayed by the student, wiped down, paper towel thrown away, and hand sanitizers are used as the student moves on to the next class. So the new classroom of students coming in come into a clean desk. Lunchtime, the same thing will happen.
If I could just interject, the students coming in may also feel more comfortable applying that cleaner and sanitizer, him or herself, and that's certainly going to be allowable. If the person feels comfortable, I'm just going to squirt my desktop and my shield here, that's fine. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No problem. Yep, absolutely. And in the cafeteria, the same thing will happen. The surfaces will be cleaned in between each lunch period. And at nighttime, all of the shields, we have a technology that we will use an electrostatic sprayer to clean down the shields in the room each night. So after the surfaces have all been cleaned by a custodian in the evening, they'll also be sprayed for sanitation.
Yeah, so we just spent a bit of time talking specifically about when the students are kind of at a desk or at a table. We had a lot of questions come in from parents about students' movement through hallways, other areas of that type. So can you talk a little bit about how we're going to work the social distancing and the safety protocols in that type of an environment?
So we're absolutely going to encourage social distancing. Anytime a student is away from their desk or away from their shield, anytime a staff member is away from a shield, they'll be wearing a mask. So in the hallway, students will be wearing a mask. Any place that anybody is convening or traveling, they'll be wearing a mask. This will also apply to fire drills. So students will evacuate the building as normal, but the difference now will be that they will have a mask on it. We are going to limit large gatherings and assemblies.
Now, what about recess? I know that's a big question for everybody who doesn't love recess, right? So for elementary, probably parents are really most looking at this. How are you handling recess? What's it going to look like for our students?
So the plan is for us to have recess outside whenever possible. We want them to be able to play. Each class will have recess with their classmates, again, keeping them together as much as possible to limit the interaction with the other students. And students will not be expected to wear masks on the playground when they're at recess, and the playground equipment will be accessible to them.
Great. So we've talked about masks, we've talked about social distancing. Another key safety protocol, of course, is frequent hand washing. So how are we going to do the sanitizing procedures and accommodations for hand washing?
So there'll be additional opportunities during the day when students will be asked to wash their hands or use hand sanitizer if a soap and water is not available for whatever reason. Before students enter the cafeteria, they'll need to use hand sanitizer or wash their hands. And teachers will be reinforcing that, especially at the lower grades. There'll be particular times. In fact, even before all of this, there were times before students went to have their snack or went for lunch that they would wash their hands. We'll also encourage on the other side of a meal that you wash your hands again, just for transmission of germs. In addition, we'll be more frequently cleaning surfaces during the day. So frequently touched areas, bathrooms will be cleaned more often and that type of thing.
What about changes for food service and lunches, breakfast offerings? Can you give us a little bit of flavor on what's going on in that area?
Sure. So the differences people will notice is, again, there'll be hand sanitizer around the cafeteria as students walk in. There'll be shields on the table. Students who would like to participate in the food service program are certainly welcome to. They'll come through the line, but the difference will be that they will not be using keypad for older students. They'll be using their lunch card. Additionally, the food will be prepackaged, so it won't be a long line. It will be just coming through and picking up your meal. Once you sit down at your seat behind your shield, you can remove your face mask and either put it in your fanny pack or hang it from your lanyard. And so that it'll just be the similar process to lunchtime. Students eat their lunch, they throw away their materials and go out to the playground for recess. For those students who are participating in remote learning, there will be an opportunity for picking up of meals at the schools, as has been happening since March.
Okay, and just a follow-up. So why aren't elementary students being asked to eat at their desk to avoid contact? Mike, do you maybe want to take this one?
Sure. So when students are having their lunch, generally speaking, the teachers are also having their lunch. And we know it's just as important for the teachers to have that midday break as it is for the students. And the support staff also have an opportunity for that midday break. So having the students eat lunch in the classroom, while it sounds good from an outside organization recommendation standpoint, from a pragmatic, practical implementation standpoint for supervision, and particularly at lunchtime when kids can get a little boisterous, we didn't think that was the safest way to go. So how could we create a safe environment and still provide a level of supervision that we believed students need? So with Debbie's help and support, we're able to get these plexiglass shields installed in the cafeteria between each seat. So students would be able to go into the cafeteria wearing their masks, get their already prepared lunch, sit at the cafeteria table, remove their mask with protections on all sides, and eat their lunch before going outside and be supervised.
Great. So, and then I assume that those surfaces in the cafeteria would then be wiped down before the next round of students would come into that space?
Yes, they will be. Yes.
Perfect. So another topic, switching gears a little bit, is school supplies, right? There's a lot of supplies that our students use throughout the course of the day. I'm thinking about things like pencils or library books. How are we going to handle that in this COVID-19 environment?
I'm happy to answer that one. You know, students typically have their own set of supplies, and we'll encourage that as much as we can. With that said, we're developing protocols as well for sharing items. But again, generally students have their own supply group, or, you know, the little ones might keep it in a pencil case or something like that at their desk. You know, one example of something we've been talking about is like the library books for the elementary students. Is there a way that they can have the books brought to them? So an online ordering system almost, instead of browsing the books, and then they can still access the library and what it has to offer, but with the safety protocols in place as much as possible. As one example anyway.
Switching gears a little bit, I know parents and students are probably wondering a little bit about sports and extracurricular activities. Those are generally a really big favorite to get out, you know, and be active and be together. Can you give us a little information about what the district has planned for that?
Yes, we want our kids to be given an opportunity to socialize and interact with their peers, whether they are in school learning or in a distance or remote learning environment. So I'll start with sports, and I'll start with interscholastic sports. The New Hampshire Interscholastic Athletic Association has not yet taken a position on fall sports, but we have, to this point, allowed our high school athletes to come in and conduct workouts with their coaches, and we will continue to do that. We were given some guidelines and restrictions by the state for youth athletics, and we're following all of those. We've added a couple of our own as well. So even if the New Hampshire Interscholastic Athletic Association left decisions up to local districts, we need someone to play against. And just as every district seems to be coming up with its own model for a return to school, every district is likely going to have a different sense for how competitive sports can operate. So at the very least, I believe that our fall athletic programs will be able to practice in a socially distant and safe way. And if we can compete in some sports, so for example, golf is a fall sport that may be able to operate. Cross country may be able to operate. Contact sports like soccer and football, maybe not, but those are decisions still to be made, and we have a few weeks before that happens. I don't personally foresee that happening, but we'll wait to determine that based on protocols and cases. Now with extracurricular activities, so if students are involved in clubs or something after school, either at the elementary level or middle school or high school level, again, we'll permit students to come in after school to participate in those activities. So that may sound counterintuitive to people that are taking the chance and sending their children to school. You know, why would someone think it's unsafe to have their child come to school, but think it's okay to come after school? I don't have an answer to that question, but a parent who believes that a smaller group or a tighter environment, a better controlled group is a safer group, might feel that it's better to have their child involved in that activity than not. So again, we're going to play the competitive athletic issue by ear. We know that our kids are already involved to some extent. We'll keep them involved to the extent we can, and extracurricular activities, whether kids are at home or at school, will be permitted. Now, we've also been asked questions like band, for example, and how band will operate. That's, you know, an extracurricular as well, and we're leaving that to our performing arts department, performing arts director. They have their own protocols, but I'm sure we'll be able to operate that in some fashion. And again, kids that are in a distance learning or remote environment will be welcome to be involved.
Great, thanks. So just tying that in, kind of shifting back actually into school, physical education, art, music, are any changes planned for these? Will elementary students be changing classes? Typically they leave the classrooms for some of these programs. Will the gymnasiums be open?
So we do intend to have our kids participate in physical education because we think we can keep them the appropriate safe distance in physical education class, whether that's in the gymnasium or outside in the fresh air when that's permissible. For art and music, we intend at the elementary level, at least for the time being, to have the teacher go into the classroom rather than the students going out. We don't necessarily believe that it's paramount to do that, but it is one added safety protocol that will assuage some concerns. At the middle school level, that's going to be more difficult to achieve because a team of students gets mixed up to go into chorus or band or music class. So it would be impractical to think that a teacher could go into that classroom. And of course, at the high school level, that's not even an option. Now, I've also been asked if kids can come into school for only the unified arts classes. And that's something that we have not discussed. I think there's some sense of comfort in knowing that a consistent cohort of kids day after day after day are sort of behaving well all together, but then a new person comes in once a week. We're just not sure if that makes the kind of sense that we want it to make. So that's a question that we'll still have to answer.
So Mike, I want to pull the thread a little bit more on access to schools and what that's going to look like. What'll be different come the fall? What about events and activities that typically take place at the school? How else is that going to look different?
Sure. So all events that don't include our students will not take place. So we won't have any organizations in our schools at the end of the school day. If we have our kids involved in an activity, we control that. We know what the safety protocols are. We can take care of our own kids. We won't allow any visitors in during the day that are not essential to whatever's going on that day. So only essential visitors, and they'll be required to wear a mask. Parents will not be able to come in and volunteer as they would normally. And when they come in for a meeting with their child's teacher or for some type of meeting, they will have to wear a mask. Vendors will also be required to wear a mask. If we can have deliveries at the end of the school day and not during the day, we'll certainly accommodate that in some way. If that, I'm not sure if that comprehensively answered the question, but essentially we're going to prevent people from coming into the school unnecessarily.
Yeah, Mike, that answered the question. The parents were mostly asking about parent access, extracurriculars that weren't associated with the school, those types of things. So thank you.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the Woodbury and the ventilation systems there. Can you give us some information about how you're addressing some of the ventilation systems and issues at the Woodbury School?
So we know that, and I've acknowledged that our ventilation system at Woodbury is older than the systems we have in our renovated schools. It doesn't mean those ventilation units are ineffective. It just means they're inefficient. So it means that they're going to have to work harder to circulate the air as frequently as some of the other units in the newer schools do on an easier basis. We're still going to be able to circulate 100% of the air in that school. It just may not be as quickly as the air is circulated in the other schools. So I've suggested that we either open windows or maybe have classes outside. And I know that is off-putting for some people, but those are a couple of additional measures we can take. Now, we've also had recommendations that in some of the spaces at Woodbury in particular, we may need to add some individual room air sanitizers, and we're looking at that now. But we wouldn't open Woodbury if we didn't feel that the staff and students could be safe.
Great, thank you.
So, a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of safety protocols, it really is dependent upon the individuals, whether it's the students, the teachers, the staff, the visitors, kind of doing the right thing and abiding by the safety protocols that were outlined in the district's plan. So how are we going to ensure that folks are being safe, making the right choices, doing what needs to be done to protect our school communities?
So do you mean in terms of using the safety protocols we have in place and maintaining our expectations?
So social distancing, wearing masks, hand washing.
Yeah, and that's truly going to be one of our biggest challenges. And we've acknowledged that internally, again, for all the weeks we've been planning. And we feel that we're going to have some problems initially because people either won't be familiar with the protocols or aren't really sure about what is expected. So there'll be some teaching that will go on in those first days. Mrs. Palmer is working with a group now to develop some training videos or learning videos that will explain what our protocols are in a relatively lighthearted, fun, but meaningful way. So we just have to acknowledge that we're going to make some mistakes early on. We have to overcome those, become more consistent in the procedures within a very short time period, and then move on from there. So we'll make some missteps, but hopefully they'll be minor or modest missteps, and then we'll become increasingly more consistent as we move along.
All right, so certainly prevention is key to reducing the risk. Why aren't you doing any temperature screenings or health checks before staff and students are entering the building?
Right. So we know that that's a recommendation for some businesses, for example. Some organizations are doing temperature checks. But when we thought about 1,400 students walking into Salem High School every day, even if we opened all our doors and had several volunteers taking everyone's temperature, it really would take an incredible amount of time, first of all, but also wouldn't necessarily be reliable. So we know there are false and negative tests, and we'd rather have students not come to school with a temperature if we can help it. So we've asked people, staff will self-assess before they come in. We'll have some specific questions that we'll ask parents to answer about their own children before their children leave the house. And then it would be by exception that parents report this. Now, some people are going to say that's ridiculous. Parents aren't going to report. There's only so much we can control. So we hope that parents, if they find that their child has a temperature of 100, I think it's 100.4 or above, that they call the school and say, look, my child had a temperature today, so I'm going to keep him or her home. So it's just not practical for us to take children's temperatures every day as they enter the school.
So I'd like to dig a little deeper into that. So if we think about simple things, runny noses, coughs, these things our children experience quite frequently, particularly in the fall. The expectations for what as a parent we should do if our children are exhibiting these symptoms, and then assuming that your answer is going to be they stay home, in order to come back, are they going to need a doctor's note or some sort of a negative test, or how's that process going to work?
So that's going to be a very challenging circumstance for everybody. Just as the decision of whether or not to send your child to school is going to be a difficult decision. If your child has a cold and that's all it is, that's going to be a parent's choice. We want them to choose to keep their children home in those circumstances when they might otherwise ask them to tough it out. It's just a cold, you have some sniffles, you have a cough, just go to school. We would rather parents not send their children to school. But we're not going to require a test because we hopefully won't know what exact symptoms are. We know that the parent will report that, but we're not going to know what the follow-up was. We're just hoping that everyone will take a protect myself, protect my neighbor approach and report the illness and not send your child to school until they've recovered. It's really going to be up to the parent as to whether or not to get your child tested, formally tested for the virus.
And what if a student needs to stay home for a week or so, you know, whether they're recovering from a cold or the flu? Will they be placed on distance learning? How are you going to approach that?
So it would be very difficult to move one child or two children into a remote environment that's already been established. We'll have teachers that are teaching their classes remotely, and then we'll have teachers teaching their classes in person. If a child is ill any other year, the teacher prepares some work and sends that work home for the child. So if it's short term, that's what we would expect to do. Now, if we discovered that it was going to be longer term, we could provide an option like distance learning if that was helpful. Now, what is long term? We really haven't defined that. Probably after a week to 10 days of sending work home and having the work brought back. If the child is going to be out longer than that, we probably have to come up with an alternative for that child.
So I'm going to ask the big what if question, and hopefully we don't face this situation, but what if a student or a staff member does test positive for COVID-19? What's going to happen then?
Yes. So, you know, some people have said it's not a matter of if someone tests positive, but when someone tests positive. And we'll take our guidance from others in that respect. If we find out that someone had tested positive, we're going to have an obligation to alert the Department of Health and Human Services. They will assign a public health nurse to this particular case. That public health nurse will take questions. If it's a teacher, we would notify those parents. We would probably adjust very quickly and go into a remote environment. We go in and clean that classroom. Now, we know that there are some adults that function fine if they have been identified. They're just not going to go out and infect others. So the teacher might be able to still teach that class, but shift to a remote environment. We do provide one-to-one devices this year. So those students would have their own devices and could shift to a remote environment with their own teacher very quickly. If it's another staff member, then we would have to notify the school community that a staff member tested positive. You know, I'll talk with the local health official officer, and he was telling me about cases in local restaurants where a dishwasher may have tested positive, but because that dishwasher didn't really have any direct contact, or maybe had direct contact with one or two other people, they didn't have to shut down the restaurant. So it really will be on a case-by-case basis, but we will err on the side of caution. I want to assure people of that. We will notify people of the incident. If we have a spike in cases, we may have to shut down our entire district for a period of time. We'll go quickly to a remote environment and hopefully do that deep clean that we have to do. And once we're given the go-ahead, bring everybody back to the school environment if we're allowed to do that.
And a follow on, Mike, to that, if that individual who tested positive, what would they need to do before they could return physically to our school environment?
Well, they would have to exceed the 14-day quarantine and then test negative. They wouldn't be able to return until they had a negative test.
Great, thank you. And then if you are someone who has been exposed to somebody else who has tested positive, and that could be in your community or elsewhere, kind of what rules apply in that situation?
So that person would have to report to the administrator, and the administrator would have to get some guidance from a central office administrator who would report that to the state, make the community report, without disclosing any personal details, just mention that someone had tested positive. And then it would only be on the advice of the state official or the public nurse official as to what contact tracing would have to be done, what people would have to be excluded, if they would have to be excluded until they tested negatively. And it's likely, I realize that tests now, the results are coming back. It's taking a little bit longer than people would want or hoped. But we're going to err on the side of caution and have people not in the school until they return after a negative test.
And so I have a follow-up question then. How and when are parents going to be notified if these circumstances end up transpiring?
So I think initially the school community would have to know. If someone in that school community tested positive, we would have to let them know. Now, if we learned that a child in the school had a sibling at the middle school and the high school, we'd probably have to let the entire school district know or make them aware. And then people are going to have to make their decisions. Initially, if that's the case, depending on what the state advises or guides us to do, we either go into a remote environment or we do a deep clean in that school and we open up in a couple of days. Again, I'm not a scientist or a health expert, so we would take our direction from the health experts. Certainly we want to, again, err on the side of caution. And if making people aware of a case is the prudent thing to do, then we'll certainly do that. We just don't want people to overreact, but we ourselves don't want to underreact.
So Mike, what happens, if there is a case in the school and school or particular classes, whatever the case might be, are forced to close? What happens at that point to those teachers and to those students?
So those students would go right into a remote or distance learning environment with their own teacher. So in a distance learning environment that starts at the beginning of the year, we may have a second grade teacher at X elementary school that's in a remote environment, but students at Y elementary school needing a teacher. So the teacher from X school is teaching students from Y school. In this case, if we closed a school, the teachers themselves would be teaching their own students in a distance learning or a remote environment.
Okay. Are there going to be restrictions for students or staff who travel on any vacation time? I know I'm hard up for a vacation and I don't know when we're going to do that, but what challenges do we have there if families decide to travel?
Sure. That's unnerving at best if you hear of someone that traveled, particularly someone that may have gone to Disney World into a Florida hotspot coming back. We'd have to rely on either the person posting pictures, family photos on some social media site, whereupon we tell them they have to self-quarantine for 14 days, or they would have to self-report that. But we would expect people to quarantine up to 14 days if they traveled and returned. But we would have to know about it. And that would be true of staff as well. We would make it clear to them that they would need to quarantine for 14 days. That's going to create some complexities for us. But we'll have to figure that out. That's just what we're going to be required to do. And if it means that a whole classroom has to move into a distant or remote environment for a short period of time, we will do that.
So right now we feel, New Hampshire is in a pretty good place compared to some other locations in our country. But what happens when conditions change and New Hampshire becomes a hot spot, or that we see a
Right.
significant spike?
So we already know that we can provide a remote environment. We know we can do that. We've learned a lot from last spring. Mrs. Palmer is going to be facilitating a meeting over the next 2 days of district staff to plan both those environments and elevate our opportunities in both those environments. We know that one of our key responsibilities coming into this school year is addressing the social emotional well-being of our students. Given the circumstances from the spring and what they had to face, now over the summer, similar types of restrictions, and now coming into the fall. So planning for that social emotional lift in the fall, whether it's in a distance learning environment or a physical environment, we need to do that well. We also need to figure out how we're going to assess academically our students coming back. So that's going to be a focus. And then there's the nuts and bolts procedural issues. So we believe that we can adjust very quickly to a distance learning environment if we indeed experience that second wave or surge that has been projected for some time late fall. And I know that people look at the science, and I know that people will are skeptical of the cases in New Hampshire or the cases in Massachusetts or the cases in Maine, and will attribute the low numbers to a lack of testing. I understand all that. But we feel strongly that our kids need to come back to school, and they need to be in a safe environment with their teacher physically. We believe that. We believe that we can keep them safe. But to your question, we will adjust very quickly if cases spike. We won't wait. I was guilty last spring of waiting and waiting and waiting. And I did not want to close school. It wasn't until the governor closed, and I accept responsibility for that. But I was much more ignorant then than I am now about this virus and its effects. And we won't hesitate to shift to a remote or distance learning environment completely if we need to.
All right, so I've gone through our list of pre-submitted questions. Clearly not all of them, but some of that really kind of hit the most here. We have about 15 minutes left, Mike. There's some questions that have been coming in to the chat box. Some of them I think we have answered in some respect. Some of them are comments, and so I didn't know if you wanted Heather and I maybe just to kind of do a quick scan of those and give you guys a couple questions to answer live.
Sure, that's fine. And it's fine that we do that now. And just for people that are asking questions, there's no way we'll get to all of them, I expect. But we'll make these part of a frequently asked questions page on our website, where we've already started these lists of questions. But sure, ask away.
Okay. Yeah, just give
One
us a minute.
one that jumped out at me, and I haven't had a chance to scan all of them, multitasking here, is grading, and what the approach to grading will be for this academic year, if we know that yet.
Okay.
I'm happy to take that question. The plan going into the school year is that we will grade the way we did prior to remote learning, so the way we had graded in the past. And again, it will be the same for the remote environment as it is for the in-school learners. If that needs to change along the way, we would certainly inform people, but that is our plan.
Okay. I see one that just wanted to touch on preschool. I know we often look at elementary, middle, and high, but somebody wanted to know about the individual desks that they don't have individual desks in preschool. So are there any differences with some of the protocols you guys spoke about early for the preschool classes?
Yep. So for the preschool rooms, they actually have small tables. They're actually very small chairs with each of those tables. We'll have, it'll look like a plus sign on a table so that 4 students could still sit around the table as they have in the past.
Oh, okay, interesting, excellent. Someone asked about bathroom procedures. The children are obviously going to be going in and out of bathrooms probably a lot more frequently. So what's the cleaning protocols going to be? How frequently are those bathrooms going to be cleaned with the high traffic?
So we'll have more than one custodian on during the daytime. So at the elementary school in the past, we only had one person there during the day. We'll have a second individual who can help keep up with those bathroom cleanings. So during the day, more frequently, the high touch surfaces will be cleaned.
I just want to add that it would be impractical to think that someone would go in and clean every time a student used a bathroom. So for someone who thinks that we're going to provide that level of cleaning, you need to keep your child in a distance learning or remote learning environment. We just can't do that. We're going to do everything we can. Again, as I said from the beginning, our goal is to keep everybody safe. And we think this is the best for everyone, and we'll do everything we can to maintain it.
Understood. Heather, are you seeing any other questions?
Yeah, one around absence policy, now that students will be expected to stay home for things that typically they would have went to school with the runny nose or something more benign like that. Is there any changes to how absenteeism will be measured?
Yeah, so we'll extend a lot of latitude, particularly for this first semester, because we know people are going to be making some difficult decisions. And I can't say that we would be able to count a student that's absent due to illness as present as we would a child that's in a remote or distance learning environment who is acknowledging the classroom teacher every day. But we will extend some understanding for all our students when it comes to attendance.
I think it's safe to say gone are the days of perfect attendance awards.
Yeah, very true. And there's a lot of questions in here as well. If we could speak at a broad level around special education, students with IEPs, 504s, obviously there's very unique situations that will require unique solutions, but at a broad level, kind of how are we thinking about that right now?
Well, we're going to address students with individual education plans or 504 accommodation plans on an individual basis. We'll make the accommodations and the adjustments necessary. So, as Mrs. Payne pointed out earlier, we have these face shields with the cloth underneath. We have some suits for people that are working with really needy children that have toileting issues. And, we're offering a tremendous amount of protection for our staff, and we'll take that to whatever level we need to keep the child safe and to keep our staff safe.
Excellent. So I see a question. I'm not sure if this was quite answered, but let's go over the question again. Will students distant learning and in-class students, are they going to have similar or the same assignments and curriculum, or will there be differences?
So what I can say at this point is that we are defining the essential curriculum that will be taught both in school and at home. Again, we're still working on which teachers will be teaching in a remote environment, which teachers will be here, but that is the intent, is that it will feel short of being in school during the day, that the curriculum that's delivered and the instruction will feel similar in both environments. Live versus remote, but.
Okay, and I think you're still formulating this whole plan based on the parent surveys due back August 1st, but someone was asking about, you know, who's going to be teaching? Will it be teachers from a specific school, or could there be some crossover where a teacher might be, you know, doing the remote distance learning from a different school? Do you think you're going to need to hire additional teachers?
So if we need to hire additional teachers, we will. We don't anticipate that we will have to. We have fewer than 5 elementary teachers right now that have indicated that they're unable to return. And we feel that if it is fewer than 5, those teachers can be assigned to students that are not going to return. Now, if we have more students that won't return, then those teachers can accommodate. We'll have to ask some additional teachers to work in a remote or distance learning environment. So we have what the teachers' answers are. We now need the students' answers to really get a handle on what our approach will be. But yes, a teacher from, I'll take North Salem School because that's your home school. If a North Salem student is in a distance learning environment, but all the North Salem teachers are coming back, that remote or distance learning student could be assigned a teacher that is otherwise assigned as a Lancaster teacher or a Barron teacher. Similarly, if a student at Woodbury is assigned to Team X, but all those teachers are in school, then that teacher might be assigned to a different team teacher in a remote environment.
Okay.
Another question revolves around busing and what changes there will be to our busing practices.
So we've looked at all our numbers, and I won't go into all the details, but we feel we can maintain the current status of our buses at 2 students per seat per bus, making sure that all the sanitizing we need to do before and after each run is completed. And then we've considered in some neighborhoods, we may have to extend the walking distance from 1 mile to 1.25 miles. But we would let parents know far enough in advance whether they would be in that pool if their children are going to have to walk to school. North Salem is the only school that doesn't have sidewalks, so nobody would be expected or is a walker right now. We're also hoping that some parents will take the opportunity to bring their children to school rather than have them ride. But again, I hate to keep deferring, but we won't know definitively until we know who is opting out, who is absolutely not bringing their children or sending their children to school physically.
And again, students and the bus driver will be wearing a mask for the duration of the ride.
Okay, so we have about 8 minutes now left. Why don't we maybe do a couple more of the chat questions, and then we'll leave it to our 3 panelists to give us some closing words. So one question I see is about kind of parents and illnesses with their children. You know, our students, they get sick, it's natural, right? And sometimes you might, they're, you know, running a slight fever, I'll give them some Tylenol and pat them on the back and send them to school. This is a new, you know, day and age for all of us. So what can you say about some kind of guiding principles for parents when we're walking this, you know, new road here together, when our they do get sick, but, you know, do we keep them home? Do parents need to always have a backup system now if their children are in school? I don't know who wants to take that.
This is very difficult for everybody, and I hope, given everything that everyone has been through, if everyone can just sustain the hardship for a while longer, whatever that means. Hopefully there's a vaccine and we're not in this circumstance, but I hope that everybody accepts personal responsibility and errs on the side of caution. That's all I can say about that. I would say, if as a parent, if your child isn't feeling well, and if that means not sending them that day, don't send them that day. Give them some chance to get better and then come to school when he's feeling or she's feeling a little bit better.
Okay, great. So I know a lot more questions have popped into the chat. Heather, is there anything that you would want to ask before we flip it back over to the panelists to close out?
Maybe one last quick one. Will there be before and after school care?
I'll let Mrs. Palmer answer that.
Yes, the same programs. So we've had Create and Discover that has run out of Lancaster, North Salem, Barron, and Fisk. That will continue. I just spoke with the director this morning, actually, so their plans are in place. And then the Boys and Girls Club runs the program at Seoul, and that the plan is for that program to continue as well. So there'll be before and after in all locations for elementary.
Okay, thank you. I think we're ready to wrap up with some final words.
So I'll start. I'll just say that first, thank you, Amy and Heather, for taking some of your time and helping us with this forum, this webinar. And I understand, I just read a comment in the chat. She keeps hearing hope, and hope is not a plan. I would love to know what tomorrow is going to bring. I would have loved to know what the next day was going to bring on March 17th. And I didn't then, and I don't now. We have a lot more information now than we had then, and we're going to use every bit of information to keep our students and our staff as safe as we possibly can, but we're not going to substitute our judgment for parents' judgments. In anticipation of opening school, there is going to be a risk. There's absolutely going to be a risk, but there are risks associated with keeping your children at home, and that's what we're trying to avoid. Giving them the academic support they need in school, which is better than the academic support we can provide them in a distance or remote learning environment. Giving them the social, emotional support that they need, taking care of their emotional well-being by giving them the opportunity to interact with classmates and the adults in a school, to feel that sense of school community is imperative. And I don't think anyone would disagree with that. They just want it to be a safe environment. And I can't guarantee that this is without risk. It's just a matter of what is your risk balance that you're willing to accept. So we've outlined our plan. I would encourage everyone to go to our website, read the plan thoroughly. We have been involved up to our necks in this since the middle of May, and I mean the reopening plan since the middle of May, not just trying to close a school year, and now not just trying to open a school year, but we have considered every conceivable option, and we have vetted it from pillar to post. We believe this plan offers the best opportunity to provide the kind of support we need with the safety that everyone requires. So I hope that people have found this helpful. Again, Amy and Heather, I can't thank you enough for giving your time and being here. And I want to thank Mrs. Payne and Mrs. Palmer for their time as well. And thank parents for listening.